Our next speaker is someone whom I've never met before, but I've long been aware of his important research. I'm a fan of yours, Dr. Kondolf. He's a fluvial geomorphologist specializing in environmental river management and restoration. At Berkeley, he teaches courses in hydrology, river restoration, and environmental science and planning. His research focuses on human-river interactions with emphasis on managing of flood-prone lands, managing sediment in rivers and reservoirs, and river restoration, and has published extensively on these topics. His books in fluvial geomorphology is a reference in the field. He has served as advisor to U.S. and state agencies on river management and restoration, provided expert testimony before the U.S. Congress, the California Legislature, the U.S. Supreme Court, the International Court of Justice, and the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague. He will discuss sedimentation impacts on California's water infrastructure. I first heard about him on this work having to do with sedimentation in dams, and actually read his paper and knew all about it before I still haven't even met him. I'm about to meet him right in front of you. Dr. Kondolf, Matt, welcome. I'm so excited. Can't wait to see you.
Here's your, great, thanks. And would you like a glass of water?
I think I'm set. Thank God. Well, that's about the best intro I've ever had. Thanks, Izzy. That's great. Actually, Izzy's talk and Lori's talk set me up quite well. In fact, Lori gave away some of my punchlines here too. I'll go ahead and talk about sediment issues in California, rivers and our water infrastructure. Okay. Let's see if we can not blind anybody with this. Okay, there we go. So the first concept is we all know rivers carry water, but they also carry sediment. And of course, this whole process of eroding the mountains and carrying the sediment towards the sea is what gives us the Sacramento Valley, for example. We're all, living and walking and building houses on top of riverine sediment. And we can think of this big system with the zone of erosion in the mountains, the zone of transport in the middle, and ultimately the zone of deposition at sea level. And we can think of this intermediate zone as a conveyor belt, where you might go out to the river each year and see a gravel bar in the same place, but the sediment is always moving on geologic time, and those particles that make up the gravel bar could be completely replaced from year to year. So it's really just temporary storage that we're seeing in certainly this part of the system. And then you can think about all the different things that we do that modify the way sediment moves through the system. Here we have mountains that we cut all the trees and increase the erosion rates or clear it for agriculture. We build roads on steep places and trigger landslides. All this increases the sediment load into the rivers. We build dams that then trap the sediment and cause decreased sediment loads downstream, all the while they're filling up with sediment themselves. And in addition to the sediment starvation that is caused by trapping from the dams, you also have sand and gravel mining in many of the rivers. And that's certainly with looking at reform of SMARA, sand and gravel mining has been that was the main motivation for SMARA to begin with, and it certainly is still one of the big issues in the states in terms of managing sediment in rivers. And then we have all these other ways in which we try to control the rivers. We build levees so they can't spill out onto the floodplain. We harden the banks. There's a lot of this kind of thing that has been done. And then within the urban areas, which are of course increasing, we get the lack of infiltration, we get more runoff, which increases the power of the water to erode. So just by paving a watershed, you can increase the energy in the stream channel and cause it to cut down with a host of impacts. And then as Lori mentioned, we get out to the coastline, and the coasts are starved of sediment because of the sand and gravel mining and the trapping by the dams upstream. So this is certainly not unique to the California situation, but it's perhaps more dramatic to our state because of the tremendous impact of the hydraulic mining debris and the rapid development of the state's resources in other ways. So we build these dams, and they interrupt the continuity of transport of sediment. And, okay, not surprising, the dams trap sediment, especially the coarse sediment, the sand and gravel, and they trap some proportion of the finer sediment, the mud and silt and clay and sand. And that percentage really depends on how big is the reservoir relative to the amount of water coming in, and therefore how long does the water sit in the reservoir and give it a chance for the silts and the clays to settle out. Here's a reservoir that I think Lori and Izzy might both have mentioned this, that filled in already, the San Clemente Dam. And I took this picture about 20 years ago from an airplane looking down at the dam that still existed at that time. Here it was, and you can see the river was pretty much full. Since then, this dam has been removed, and this big slug of sediment has been stabilized in place. The work was finished in 2015, and anyway, we're interested in seeing how things have responded in this wet year. This cost, well, the official price tag was $83 million. I'm sure if you count up everything at the end, it's going to be more. But even at the official price tag, that's still quite an expensive project, $83 million. That's way more than they spent building the dam to begin with. And we have 1,400 dams around the state that are large enough to be regulated by the Division of Safety of Dams. And I would wager that every one of those eventually will cost way more to deal with, to take apart, to decommission than cost to build. Don't worry though, that's the grandchildren, the great-grandchildren. We're putting that off onto other generations. Here's another example. This is Mathias Dam. This one hasn't been dealt with yet. It's probably going to cost around $140 million. They thought they had a solution. They thought it would have been taken out 10 years ago. Another case, the dam's filled up with sediment. Another case like San Clemente, there are safety issues with the dam. And these two are part of a group of 4 we call the Big 4 dams that have filled with sediment and pose problems. Again, San Clemente's been taken out, but we still have, we have an uprise of some applause for Searsville Dam on San Francisco Creek. Well, again, it's full of sediment. You can't just remove the dam and let the sediment go down. This is the problem with all our California dams. If you just release the sediment that's been stored there, what's going to happen? It's going to go downstream, it will fall out, aggrade the channel, and then the channel capacity is less, so the next time you have a flood, you'll get more flooding. And you know, even if you don't really have that problem, you can guarantee that you will have lawyers who hire consultants who say that that's the problem, and you have so many expensive houses along the rivers and streams that no one wants to take that chance, right? So anyway, that's the problem that they have at Searsville. What's downstream? Palo Alto, Menlo Park, you know, everything's worth $2 million, and everyone's got a lawyer or is a lawyer, so you don't want to touch the dam and possibly be held responsible for sediment going downstream. San Clemente taken out, Mathias, Ringe Dam on Malibu Creek. It's in a state park now, but it was built for other purposes over 100 years ago. And state parks doesn't really want to touch it. Nobody wants to touch it. Again, downstream there, it's the lawyers and movie stars too, so you don't want to mess with them. Anyway, so these are the tip of the iceberg. These are small water supply reservoirs that have already filled with sediment. We did a study to try to understand what are the next ones going to be? What are the next dams that are going to pop up like this? And in this study, we found a remarkable lack of data on reservoir sedimentation, but even discrepancies in the number of dams listed in the National Inventory of Dams and the California database. But anyway, we went ahead and applied this model, the 3W model, which looks at the historical rates of sediment accumulation and then projects them into the future, but taking into account the fact that we have dams upstream in the watershed, so the sediment yields to your reservoir will be reduced by these other ones, and as the reservoirs fill with sediment over time, their trap efficiency decreases. So they start filling up, they don't catch as much sediment because there's not as much to store. So we looked at this, and because of the lack of data, we had to extrapolate from the existing data, and we did that by geomorphic province. So within a geomorphic province, we collected all the reservoir sedimentation data that had been done, and then took the median rate. And I'm sure someone could do more with this, but that seemed like a pretty good solution. But the key thing here is to see the big problems are in the coast ranges, or I should say the high sediment yields, are in the coast ranges and the transverse ranges. This is kind of an outlier here. It's only one data point or something like that. Sierra Nevada, what we're talking about here today, actually has relatively low sediment yields. The hydraulic mining, of course, that dramatically increased the sediment yield for about a 25-year period, and then we've still been recovering from that since. But naturally, the Sierra Nevada are not as erodible as the Coast Range. The Coast Range is junky rock being rapidly uplifted and being hammered by coastal storms. That naturally produces a lot of sediment. So when we look at our results, the red dots are dams where we estimate the reservoir capacity would be 25% or less remaining. So in other words, of the total capacity that the dam had when it was built, we expect that only 25% or less remains. And you'll see that there are quite a few up in the Sierra and the Cascades. As I recall, those are mostly pretty small, like PG&E diversion structures, things like that. And along the Coast Range and the transverse ranges, this is where you have Ringe, Matilaha, San Clemente, and Searsville. And again, looking at the coast and transverse ranges. So very active areas geologically, a lot of naturally high sediment yields, and then of course that's been exacerbated by land use. And what we see so far are these relatively small reservoirs that were built for water supply, and they're in an area of high sediment yield, so they fill up fast. Compare that to something like Shasta or Oroville, huge reservoirs. And, for there, the times to fill them would be measured in hundreds of years or more. In fact, you might never be able to fill up something like Shasta with all the weathered rock and soil in the landscape. Even if you scraped it all in there, I'm not sure if you'd fill up the reservoir. So when you look at aggregate across the state, the percentage losses are not that high, but we're going to have a lot more of these hot spots that are very expensive to deal with. So we did this modeling, extrapolating from the existing data in a systematic way, but it would be nice to have more data. And Senator Pavley introduced SB 1259 in 2014, which would direct DWR to collect data on the rate of capacity loss in California reservoirs. But the bill was not funded, and so that has not happened. So we continue to accumulate sediment in our reservoirs. We don't really know how much, how bad the problem is, and perhaps more importantly, we haven't been doing anything about it either. We'll come back to what can you do. But looking at the problem globally, the loss of capacity to reservoir sedimentation can be seen as a serious threat to water supply. This is from George Annandale's book, Quenching the Thirst. This is the per capita storage of sediment, and this is the net storage and the per capita storage. So both curves show a peak in the 1980s or 90s, dropping off, and basically what this is showing is that the rate at which reservoirs are filling in with sediment around the world exceeds the rate at which new reservoirs are being built. And as I'll show you the rate at which new reservoirs are being built in a moment, which it really surprises me because we have a big burst coming on the scene. But what is the answer to this? We have to build more dams? No, and I think Lori referred to this problem as well. We've already built out the really good dam sites. Every dam you build today is going to be less efficient, more expensive for the amount of benefit that you get. So it makes a lot of sense to try to sustain the capacity that we have if we can do that. I alluded to the 4 dams that are already filled in California as posing safety problems. This is an example of the kind of safety problem. This is a Barlin Dam on the Dahan River in Taiwan. This was one of 120 dams built upstream of the Ximen Reservoir, which is the main water supply reservoir for Taipei and kind of the Taiwanese Silicon Valley. These dams were designed just to stop sediment from getting into the big reservoir downstream, which, if you think about it, is not really a sustainable solution. Anyway, this is Barlin Dam in 2002. By 2004, it was full. In July 2007, here it is. A typhoon in 2007 caused the dam to fail. In a few hours, it released 7.5 million cubic meters of sediment. So the capacity of the dam, it had stored about 10 million cubic meters of sediment, and in a few hours it released 7.5 million, which is 10 times the amount of sediment that was released in the Marmot Dam, deliberate removal, for example. So pretty impressive. We're very lucky that downstream it was just a canyon. There was no people living there, and most of that sediment went about 10 kilometers downstream and then filled up the next reservoir like this. So this raises the general question that most dams are still not designed and planned on a life cycle basis. How quickly will they fill with sediment? What will be the decommissioning costs? And what are the downstream impacts of sediment starvation? And if that full life cycle was taken into account, if, for example, in doing the cost-benefit analysis for a dam, if you had to include the cost of decommissioning, a lot of these dams would not look so rosy economically as they apparently have. Cost-benefit analysis used for dams relies on a discount rate, which is kind of standard economic thinking. And this idea is you want to capture the time value of money. So a certain amount of money is worth more today than it would be in the future in the eyes of an economist, because if you have the money today, you can put that in an investment, and then 10 years from now, that money will be worth more. That's the idea. And that results in what we call the tyranny of discounting, because nearly all future benefits and costs 30 years out are discounted to almost nothing. So future costs are easily ignored. And these cost-benefit analyses do not include the cost of decommissioning, even a discounted cost of decommissioning. It just doesn't appear in the analyses. So there are alternative approaches, one of which is to think of reservoir storage as an exhaustible resource, like something that you're mining and you're going to run out of it. And then there have been other proposals like setting up a retirement fund for each dam to deal with the decommissioning eventually, charge user fees, again, to go into kind of a fund for decommissioning, or to use lower discount rates or even declining discount rates. And this is being played around with by the World Bank. I don't know if they've actually adopted this policy yet, but at least it's being discussed there. So for California, you could say it's pretty much too late. We've already built out our reservoirs. There are no doubt some places where we could retrofit, where we could add large low-level outlets to dams, although anytime you fiddle around with a structure like that, there's some safety concerns. Or we could perhaps build bypasses, which they've been doing in Japan and a number of places, to bypass the sediment around dams. But when we look, there's lots of opportunity to implement concepts of sustainable sediment management in new dams that are being built, not here, but around the world. I mean, we get the impression, being on the west coast of the US, that we're in an era of dam removal, but globally, it's quite the opposite. We expect a doubling of world hydropower capacity within the next 1 to 2 decades. And what is this? Well, of course, it's carbon-free energy, and it's also an investment. So there's, and a lot of this it's not being funded by the World Bank anymore. It's being funded by Chinese investors, Russian investors. There's a lot of money out there. I mean, we've been buying TVs and stuff from China for so long. They have money, they want to invest it in something, and what better thing than a hydroelectric dam? So we see the red are new dams planned around the world. The blue are dams under construction. And many of them are being built by the Chinese overseas, and they're doing the same thing at home. This is a map of the Yangtze River Basin going up into the Jinsha and so on. And these are all the dams that are being, the gray ones are functioning, red are under construction, yellow being prepared, and the white are planned. There's 140 dams being built in the Yangtze River Basin upstream of Three Gorges. Their cumulative capacity will be 10 times the capacity of Three Gorges Dam. So another effect of trapping sediment in reservoirs is downstream you have the release of sediment-starved or hungry water. And this causes the channel to downcut, you wash away spawning gravels, you undermine infrastructure, lots of things like this, and you lose channel complexity. And, of course, without that sediment, you accelerate the erosion of beaches and deltas. So again, there are ways to sustainably plan, design, and manage and operate dams, but they're rarely done. Somehow it's just not on the table because the way that things are analyzed, it doesn't matter, according to the official approach. So that's it. I'm going to be on Jeff Mount's panel this afternoon, and I think it looks like my topic is more or less the same then, so I won't repeat myself, but maybe we can find other angles for this topic. Okay, thank you.